Hey everybody, this is Kimberly, anti-diet coach, holistic nutritionist, and self-empowerment aficionado, and you're listening to the Love Your Naked Ass podcast, the show that helps women just like you ditch their diets, kick their inner critic to the curb, and make peace with their bodies so they can focus on what's important in life, living it. Let's get started. Today, our episode is going to be a bit different. Today, I wanted to speak off the cuff about pain and grief. No bullet points or outline to keep me on point. So if I go on a tangent, you know why. I woke up this morning just feeling really called to share this story with you. And my hope is that your takeaway is that pain and grief come in all shapes and sizes. And there isn't a right answer on how to deal with it or what to do with it. And sometimes it takes years for you to actually face it, as in my case. But when you finally do allow yourself to go through this space, you recognize how much weight you've held on to, and you find yourself literally standing at a crossroads, wanting to honor, in my case, the person who I lost, but make him prouder than he's ever been of you and just go for the gusto. So like I said, there's no right way to feel this. And I just want you to know that it looks different for everyone. So the first time my dad had chemo was shortly after we learned that he had a rare type of cancer called angioimmunoblastic T-cell lymphoma. For those of you who don't know what that is, angioimmunoblastic T-cell lymphoma is a type of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Like I said, it's quite rare. Of course, our family would find a way to have the rarest forms of cancer. My mom is currently going through chemo right now for a rare form of ovarian peritoneal cancer, which I'm sure I'll talk about in a later episode. And this type of cancer really it groups other malignancies that really affect the lymphatic system. And so how we found out about this was my dad was on vacation at the beach, a place he loves to spend time with at my mom. They were looking at beach houses. The dream was to buy a beach house for the family one day after they retired. And he started feeling sick, and they thought he had the flu. But the strangest piece was his stomach was growing rapidly. And listen, my dad was a big, larger than life man, 6'1", about 180, maybe 190 pounds on a good day. And he never got sick. If he did, it was rare and it lasted a day, and it never took him down. And he was just like, no, he seemed like the man was invincible, that nothing could ever get him, right? And I guess as a daughter, you look at your dad, or I looked at my dad, like he could do no wrong. And he was this larger than life, amazing man who always came in and saved the day. And all of a sudden, he was so sick, no one could figure out what was wrong with him. And he looked almost 6 months pregnant, which is a little strange when you are a man. So they did all these tests. They couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. They diagnosed him or thought he might have hepatitis C. And it ended up being this rare form of cancer. And his stomach was filling with fluid because of his lymph nodes. And this cancer was diagnosed as stage 4, which was a total shake to our entire family. And I will not forget it. I will never forget when I got the phone call. I was in a grocery store called Wegmans. I was walking around with my son, and my dad told me that he has cancer and it's stage 4. And I couldn't stop myself from crying. And he just said to me, Kim, I'm going to beat this. I'm superhuman. And I laughed because I believed him. Like, I genuinely believed that my dad was superhuman. So that was all I really needed to hear. And I just did what I needed to do, being the supportive daughter, helping him go to chemo sessions or doctor's appointments, etc. So the first chemo session happened quite rapidly. because he just wasn't feeling any better. And they kind of pushed up the process, so to speak. So we're sitting at the chemo clinic, my mom and I. My sister was either away for business or had this important meeting at work, and she had decided she was going to go to the second one. Well, we never actually got to the second one, at least not right away. So we were sitting in this chemo clinic for about 8 hours or so. And I don't know if you've ever sat in a chemo clinic. I've done several, unfortunately, throughout the last couple of years now with my parents, and it's not fun. If you have an option, I would absolutely suggest you get a private room. It takes a little of the sting away. But we're sitting in a clinic room. So there's this big, large room with these windows that you can look outside and see the beautiful trees and whatnot. And there's chairs that go in a circle. And every single person sitting in the chair is hooked up to a machine. And they're all getting poison pumped into their body. And it's such an experience to just sit there and witness, because no one asks for cancer, right? No one asks for cancer. And then we treat it with this poison that we like to call cocktail, which makes me laugh because it's so far from what I would imagine a cocktail being. And the nurses who administer this chemo literally show up in like semi hazmat suits because it can't touch their skin or their body because it's that poisonous. Think about that. That's just so fucked up. We treat cancer with poison. And we wonder why cancer patients after the fact have such a hard time recuperating and getting back to normal. And then their side effects are just there's just so many side effects. And the reoccurring ones are just awful, in my experience, watching my friends and family go through cancer and chemo. In any event, we finally leave the hospital. My dad is overly tired. And of course, he still tries to make us laugh during the session because he knows that we're all freaked out and that I am super upset watching my superhero dad be hooked up to machines getting poison pumped through his veins. And not even, I want to say it was less than a half an hour, I get a call from my mom. She is absolutely freaking out. My dad passed out, face first on the floor. She has the ambulance on their way. I was supposed to pick up my son. I actually did pick up my son. And I'll never forget this image in my brain. I literally had my son. He was, I don't know, he was about maybe 5 or 6 at the time. Honestly, it's all a blur in terms of ages, but he was little enough where he was light enough and little enough where I could carry him. And I picked him up like a football. And my mom's mom happened to live 3 houses down from her. And she was older and elderly and definitely not someone I would normally leave my son with. But my husband was on his way, and I knew that for 20 minutes that it wasn't a big deal. And I dropped my son off at my grandmother's house and had no idea what the next step would be or what would happen. So my dad had already been taken to the hospital. My mom and I rushed to the ER, back to the hospital we came from, except this time we weren't in the chemo ward. We weren't in the chemo suite, so to speak. We were on the emergency side. And here's my dad looking little and frail and just scared even though he said he wasn't. And he was having trouble breathing. And the nurses and doctors would come in and check, and we were sitting there and waiting and waiting and waiting. And I was starting to get more and more pissed because I understand that there are many people in the emergency room. And at that point, the only person I cared about was him. And then it happened. His eyes rolled back in his head and his neck went back and he completely lost function. He started breathing really strange and no one was helping. And within a matter of seconds, I looked around the ER, I opened the curtain, and I completely lost my mind, yelling all sorts of profanities to get people moving. And within minutes, I literally had every nurse and every ER doctor at my dad's bedside. Unfortunately, because of my outburst, I did get kicked out of the ER, which I'm completely okay with. because they were able to stabilize him enough to trach him and bring him back to life. I know they used paddles. I know they had to trach him. And then we waited. And it felt like days, and it was only hours. And no one could give us any answers. That night, we ended up in the ICU suite where families go and wait for their loved ones. And my dad was admitted into the ICU. We were allowed to see him, and he was hooked up to like every freaking machine known to man. And he had a trach in his throat, so he couldn't talk, and he had to breathe through that for a while. And they were trying to figure out what had gone wrong and what had happened. I just I felt like it was the most surreal experience I've ever been through. That night, we all slept there in our clothes that we wore that day. I don't even think we had dinner. And I don't really remember sleeping. All I remember is crying a whole lot and feeling like heavy, really heavy. I think it took a couple of days for them to really figure out what was happening. And there was all kinds of complications. One of the doctors said that the chemo worked so well that it broke up and kind of blasted so many of the cancer cells, and they like blew up in his system. And it just was so much overload on my dad's body, which I guess in retrospect was a good thing because it did break up a lot of the cancer. However, to get back on track and to have my dad walk out of the hospital, it was what feels like a month. Now, don't quote me on that because I'm not sure it was exactly a month, but it was quite some time until he left. And I went there every single day. Hell or high water, rain or shine, I would go to visit. At first, he was in the ICU and he couldn't speak at all. And I would just sit by his side and hold his hand and pray. I don't think I prayed more in my life than during that time. Like I said, he had multiple complications. He had to have dialysis. His kidneys were shutting down. There was all these different issues with organs not functioning properly. And there was a lot of times we thought he wasn't going to walk out, that we were going to lose him. And I couldn't imagine my life without the man who I spoke to every single day from the time I was 21. The good news is, me being the fiery bitch self that I am, because when I want something, I absolutely make myself known. I started doing some research on the most prevalent, most amazing chemo cancer doctors in our area for this rare form of cancer that no one at this hospital seemed to know about. And I stumbled on some names and I started to doing research and looking at studies and pulling up all kinds of data on this type of cancer. And then I went to my father's team and asked them to move him down to the University of Penn in Philadelphia. And I wanted him to see this specific oncologist. Of course, there was bumps and bruises along the way for sure, because when I want something and I get into that headspace, I will not move and I will dig my feet in until I get the ball rolling in the direction that I want it to. I'm just going to leave that for a whole different story. All I can tell you is that when I did finally take my dad home, I had nurses telling me that I was in the wrong career and that I should be an advocate for sick patients who are, feeling so terrible that I could help them advocate their medical plan with the doctors to get them where they need to go. So I'll just leave it at that. The day I took my dad home, I will never forget it. My mom had to work because, unfortunately, she had taken so much time off that she was very concerned that she was going to lose her job. Now, of course, we were always a two-household income family, my parents, and I know she was super stressed about that. And although my dad's company worked with him and they were the best company ever during this period of time, I get the financial worry and all the things takes a toll on each other. So I volunteered to bring him home. Now, meanwhile, every day during the hospital when he was in a normal room, he and I would when he was sleeping, I would work, and when he was awake, we would watch the Food Network and different food stations and cooking shows, and we talked about all the fun foods we were gonna make when he came home. And the one dish that he had asked for when he came home was coq au vin. And so I know that week we got all the ingredients together, and you bet your ass we made coq au vin. And although he couldn't taste really well and probably didn't even want to eat it, and it probably didn't taste the way he imagined it because of all the drugs in his body, he absolutely had a meal with us and had a smile on his face. And I will just never forget that moment. Now, over time, my dad did continue to have chemo, and it didn't go nearly as crazy as the first one, thank God. And he ended up having a transplant of sorts. It wasn't a bone marrow transplant, and off the top of my head, I can't even remember what kind of transplant it was. And then he had to go into the hospital for that as well, down in the city, and that was a whole ordeal in of itself. But he did ultimately come home and go back to work. So I'm fast forwarding here. The one thing I want to say is that cancer patients, just so you know, they're not the same after they have chemo. At least not the ones that I've loved and lost. They pretend they're good, but the after effects of this drug are just so far and wide. The nerve pain, the indigestion, the constipation, the constant bone pain. It's so much and nothing that we ever ask for. My dad lived several years after this. And in fact, he was considered cancer free. But in 2016, around Thanksgiving, he started getting sick again. And to be totally truthful with you, he looked awful, like almost not like my father. And he was not happy at all. And I had this weird, eerie feeling that just something wasn't right. He had a bunch of tests. No one could figure it out. And then December hit, which is one of the months that I love the most because I am such a Christmas nerd. And on December 9th, my grandmother, the one who took care of my son all those years before, my mom's mom passed away. Now, she lived a great life. She was at the age that we often lose our grandparents, and she died peacefully, but it just sucked. But what was even more crazy is not even a day later, my dad couldn't even shower on his own, and my mom took him to the hospital. And the story is he really never came home. They couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. He was acting crazy. He was certainly not himself. His eyes started to look like they were bugging out of his head, and all his organs were like not cooperating. They were still functioning at this point, but they were just not cooperating. And I was absolutely beside myself, constantly talking to the doctors, calling my dad's oncologist, trying to figure out what was the next step to save this man. We had to medevac him ultimately back down to Penn. And I will never forget the sound of the propellers of that helicopter. In fact, to this day, I still cannot even stand to hear those propellers. And since all of this has happened, we've moved into this house in the woods. And unfortunately, we kind of live in what I would say, like there's a couple hospitals around us. And I feel like the medevac helicopter flies over our house, several times a year. And it's distinctly different than that other helicopter. For some reason, I can pinpoint it. And it's just like, it gives me such anxiety. So here we are. We're rushing down in the wintertime. It's like, 2 weeks before Christmas at this point? And I'm literally living out of a hotel room. We're living out of a waiting area in the Presbyterian Penn Hospital. where they're doing everything they can for my father and nothing is working. And just each organ is shutting down one by one. He had good days, he had bad days. He had good days, he had bad days. So we finally get to a point where he's stable. My mom convinces us, my sister and I, to go home. My husband was graduating from college the following morning. So my sister and I come back to my house. We try to go to sleep. And within 4 hours, I get a call in the middle of the night that my dad has taken a turn for the worse. I wake my sister up. And honestly, my sister is a speed demon, let me tell you. We got down to the city probably in less time we will ever get to the city ever in our lifetime, ever again. It was like there was absolutely no one on the road, and it was just like a straight sail for us. And it was almost like cars disappeared or maneuvered to the left and right to let us have the lane to just get there. It was the most surreal experience, and my sister drives with a lead foot, but that's beside the point. When we got there, the doctor came out and said, there's nothing else we can do. It's time to start talking about what the next decision is. And ultimately, she was saying, it's time and we have to let him go. Now, of course, coming to this decision is never an easy thing, right? It's not. And there's so many emotions that rage within you when you have to come to this place where you're like, oh my God, I have to seriously think about letting a man go or a person go in your life that you couldn't even imagine being sick, let alone in this position. My mom was so distraught, rightfully so. This was the love of her life. They were married for over 40 years. They did everything together. And their relationship was one for the books. So she was crying and yelling a little bit and just distraught with, like I said, rightfully so. My sister, she didn't want to have any part of the decision at all. And I got it. I understood that 100%. It's just every person is wired so differently. My dad's brother and partner were there, and they absolutely were the best support I could have ever asked for in a million years. And they mean so much to me. They always did, but that experience just really, I don't even know how to describe it. It like concreted our relationship. Like they are eternally stuck with me for the rest of their lives. So here we were, early Saturday morning, probably it was 2, 3 o'clock. I just said, it's time to let him go, Mom, because he's not walking out of here alive. Or alive in the respect that he's not going to walk out of here on his own 2 feet. And there's no way you want him in a wheelchair in a vegetative state. Like, even if they can get his organs to function properly, he's not going to be right. Like, his brain activity was decreased and a lot of his organs weren't even working right. And he was literally living off machines, let's be clear. So on December 17th, at around 9 a.m. in the morning, we pulled the plug. My dad fell asleep. It was a matter of minutes. Like legit minutes. In fact, I turned around and he was gone. I think the most fucked up part was I just started to function. Like I cried and I went into not fix it mode, but like I went into existing mode. Now, what I didn't tell you is before my dad got medevaced, and the last time I spoke to him, he had told me to have faith and that if anything ever happened to him, to take care of my mom and my sister and that I would be okay. And I took that on like a badge of honor. Like I took that in the literal sense. And from that day forward, all I did was make sure, or at least I tried, maybe not well, but I tried to keep my mom and my sister afloat. Because let's be clear, after you lose someone who you love, who's larger than life, literally 10 days before Christmas, you just function. And now we have these little kids, my son and my sister's son, who believe in Santa and who love Christmas. And we had to turn around and pull off a Christmas and almost pretend because I was just in a fog. And I know that I wasn't the only person. That Saturday morning, I called one of my best friends and told her that he had passed. And then I turned around, went into a private room to just be alone. I opened up my computer, turned on my husband's graduation. Thankfully, they were videoing it. My whole family was supposed to be there. My dad probably was the proudest of him. And he was the one who wanted to go and had all these plans that we were going to have this party and dinner afterwards to celebrate this big monumental moment. And he couldn't make it. So I watched him graduate, shut the computer screen, knowing that I had to not only go home and tell my husband that my dad was gone, but also my son. What's crazy is it's now January of 2023. It's been 7 Christmases, and it still gets me every single time. So my point is, and why I decided to share this with you today, is because grief has no timeline. It shows up in peaks and valleys, year to year, month to month. Some people don't function at all for years after, and some people are like me who just go into fix-it mode, function mode, and just exist and don't want to talk about it. But what I can say is that if you don't get it out and you don't talk about it, and you just keep bottling it up inside, it literally eats you from the inside out. So that's why I'm sharing this story with you today. Because if you or anyone you love is suffering from pain or grief, and they haven't talked about it, and they haven't shared it with someone, do it. Call your friend, call your mom, call your sister, call someone. Because once you can start to talk about it and you can let it out and you can have those tears and you can openly admit that this was the shittiest day of your life, that's when you start feeling better. That's when you can start moving forward. I promised my father during that hospital stay, the week leading up to his demise, that I was going to do something magical with my life. And although he said I already did, I told him I was going to make him proud in heaven every single day. I decided, after making the notion and setting the intention and putting the stake in the ground saying that I was going to start this podcast, that at some point I was going to share this story about my dad, a superhero, to let you all know that as strong as I am and as commanding as I can be and as tall as I stand, pain and grief have no boundaries. It affects us all. So if you have a story, you have some grief to share, and you have no one to talk to, reach out. I'm here to listen. Because I don't want anyone to let this grief take over their life where they can't continue to live. I think that's the lesson I've learned here. My dad had all of these dreams, and he never got to actually fulfill any of them because he didn't live long enough. So let this grief go. Talk about it. Because we only have one life to live. And I would hate to see you or anyone else that I love not move forward and fulfill their dreams because of that pain or grief. All right, that's it for this week's episode of Love Your Naked Ass. I want to thank you for being here with me, and I can't wait to chat with you next week.
If you love this podcast, hit subscribe, tap to rate, or drop me a review. And be sure to follow me over on Instagram at Kimberly Riggins and join my free Facebook group, The Happy Healthy Body. Again, I'm Kimberly Riggins signing off, wishing you peace, love, wine, and of course, an abundance of chocolate. I'll see you next time.